So the question becomes, since obviously friends and family canvassing is a superior methodology, is how can people, ordinary folks, get started doing this kind of work? And often what I find is there's a certain fear about doing it because not all people are accustomed to talking politics in their families and in their relationships. And so that's what David and I focus on, is like, how can you have these conversations in a way that you prioritize the relationship above all else, and yet still are able to have an influence on others. So the first thing that you do is list the people in your personal network. And this is like you just cast a very wide net here. Who are all of the people, friends, family, colleagues, who you could possibly contact? In step 2, the goal is to reach out and ask people 2 questions. And these questions can be done by phone, email, text, whatever form of communication you feel most comfortable with. Now, these 2 questions are pretty simple. The first question is, how likely is it that you will vote? And you try to get them to answer that question on a scale. So you don't want them to just say, oh, it's really likely or not very likely. Pin them down a little bit with a number. And I like to use a scale from 0 to 100%, with 0 being absolutely not, you're not gonna, nothing could get you to vote, and 100% being absolutely going to vote. The only thing that could stop me is if I dropped out between now and the election. The second question is, how likely is it that if you vote, you would vote for my candidate, whoever that candidate may be? And again, you want to put that on a scale from 0 to 100%. So if I am supporting Biden, for example, the question becomes, how likely is it that you will vote for Biden? If you vote, that you would vote for Biden for president? Is it absolutely not, you would never even consider it, or absolutely he is the only choice right now, 100%? And then we move to step 3, which is where we really get strategic. Now that we have gathered this information, we have our list of friends and family, we chart people's answers on a grid so we can figure out exactly what our goals are and how we can prioritize our efforts. So I create a chart using the answers to the 2 questions. So on the vertical, the horizontal, no, vertical axis is the person's likelihood of voting. So if somebody has a nearly 100% likelihood of voting and high support for my candidate, in this case we'll say Biden, then I would put a point up in the very right-hand corner to represent them. Now, if I encounter someone who likes Biden, supports him, but really isn't planning to vote, and in fact is not even registered, then I would put them down in this lower right-hand quadrant. So you fill it in with these points so you can prioritize your efforts. Once you've plotted your graph, the next step is to compare it using this legend. And what the different colors on this graph represent are the different goals you are going to pursue with voters in different areas. So if a person is in the blue area, that means they generally support your candidate, quite strongly support your candidate, but they have varying degrees of commitment to actually voting. And depending on where they fall, you are going, your efforts are largely going to be about making sure they vote. If they fall in the yellow area, they don't really have a preference. And so with those voters, what you're going to be focusing on is largely persuasion. And if they're in the red area, that means they support your opponent. And the goal there is really to demobilize and dissuade rather than try to get them to support your candidate.
But interestingly, the way you do that is through compassion.
Yes, yes. So there are essentially 3 priorities. The first is activation, mobilization, and registration. The second is persuasion and engagement. The third is dissuasion and demobilization. One of the things that's nice about this is you end up focusing first on people who largely already agree with you, which makes it a lot easier when you're getting started to introduce politics into your relationships. So just to say a few words about each of these priorities and what they mean. So for priority 1, it's going to include activate, which means these are the people who are like you, fully committed to who they are voting for, and fully committed to your candidate and fully committed to voting. The goal with these people is to actually get them to do more than vote, whether that be donate to candidates or actually join you in doing friends and family canvassing. For the next group, these are people who aren't quite in that upper right-hand corner, but are in support of your candidate, and your goals are going to just be make sure they get to the polls, make sure they mail in that ballot, whatever it takes to make that happen.
Again, I'll remind people that 45% of Americans don't vote.
Right, right.
So you know people who don't vote.
Absolutely, we all do, even if we don't think we know them. Priority number 2, again, is persuasion, which means convincing them to vote for your candidate. And if they fall into this yellow area below the horizontal line, you also have to do some engagement. These are people who are both have no strong opinions about politics, but a large part of that is because they aren't even paying attention, and getting them to pay attention to the election will set them up to then be persuaded. And the final priority are those voters who are strongly in the other camp. And I should have mentioned earlier, there is a large white zone on this graph. These are people that at this point in the election cycle, we don't actually talk to. If someone falls in that lower left-hand quadrant, there's not enough time to have a positive impact. These are people we will focus on after the election and in terms of healing and rebuilding relationships. But if you want to influence election outcomes, they're not the people we will talk to. It's those.
You're not saying hang up on them, talking to them, though, are you?
You do not hang up on them. You never cut off relationships. Absolutely. And then one last way in which we prioritize our contacts with people is starting with people we feel closest to rather than people we feel farthest from. And this is, you know, it makes sense partly from the perspective of you want to invest more in relationships that are more meaningful to you. But it also is important from a political perspective in that we have more influence with people who are close to us. Even when they disagree with us, we have more ability to shape their political beliefs and actions. So quickly, just to review what it takes to get started: make a list of friends and family, ask them the 2 questions, get strategic, chart it out on the graph, set your goals, prioritize, and then start having the conversations.